We advanced for 2 days, reconnoitering right and left for fear of a surprise attack. Finally, on August 20th, 1914, war began in earnest for us. It was our first serious engagement, and it showed me how a most gentle fellow, like my friend Murbach, could suddenly become savage in the excitement of battle. It was about 6 a.m., and we had just left Tintage, where we had been quartered. We were marching along the road which leads from Martelange to Neufchâteau, taking all precautions necessary to our safety. Our battalion was leading. Behind us came the 1st and 5th Battalions of the 87th Infantry. The 80th Fusiliers and the 81st Infantry were on our left. About 1 p.m. a patrol coming from L'Englier notified us that we could advance without danger, since that locality was not occupied by the enemy. After having some soup prepared by the field kitchens, we resumed our march. All of a sudden, on our right, we heard an unwanted noise, altogether new to us. We knew right away what it was: a shell. Several dropped quite close to us. Major Schmidt immediately gave the following order. The 5th, 6th and 7th Companies will advance in skirmish line, taking shelter behind the hill which lies before them. The 8th Company will stay behind in reserve. All the officers, sword in hand, marched in front of their men, as in a review. The French and Belgians aimed very well and, sad to say, were aided by our own 27th Artillery, who fired at us. After being reinforced by the 87th Infantry, Colonel Pouder ordered the attack. We could see now with our own eyes what war, which we only knew from books, really is. Men hit by a bullet flung up their arms, turned about and fell, dead or wounded. Everywhere one heard cries of pain and groans mingling with the whizzing of bullets and shells, the hurrahs of the soldiers and the commands of the officers. Captain Dunker was wounded twice and died that very evening. Lieutenant Eager, wounded in the hand, soon fell down in a faint. The 8th Company, which had until now been held in reserve, advanced in its turn to the left of the 5th Company. All of a sudden the village of L'Englier began to burn, and the 2 last-named companies were ordered to take possession of it. The staff of the 2nd Battalion, to which I belonged, was now on the right wing of the 2nd Company. Lieutenant Brunn, an officer much loved by all his soldiers, fell just as he was giving an order, pierced through the heart. Non-commissioned officer Steinbach fell at the same time. At last we actually entered L'Englier, which presented a sad spectacle. Houses were burning everywhere. The streets were strewn with the bodies of soldiers and horses. A Belgian officer was lying across a beam that was still burning. His body was half burnt, and his distorted face expressed horrible pain. This unfortunate man had fallen there, wounded, and must have been slowly burned alive. Murbach and I, with our orderlies, were just then at a telephone post in the depot. All of a sudden we heard the screams of women and children. Going out into the street, we saw a group of civilians, composed of 4 men, 2 women and 5 children, in the midst of a troop of officers and soldiers. Soldiers were kicking these unfortunate people and striking them with their rifle butts. The soldiers accused them of having fired at Colonel von Kriestein, commanding the 87th Infantry, who had just been wounded. He died in Germany shortly after. Their guilt could not be proven, for French, Belgian and German bullets were whizzing in every direction. Murbach took these unhappy people under his protection. In another house nearby, a woman, holding a young child in her arms, was killed by a musket blow in the presence of her husband. He was later stabbed with a bayonet by a soldier of the 87th. I do not know what became of the child. In front of the station, a young lieutenant of the 87th was ordering a non-commissioned officer and 2 men to set fire to the hotel, under the pretext that it was from there that von Kriestein might have been fired at. These 3 men first entered the hotel cellars in the hope of finding some wine. They found it, to be sure, but they immediately began to quarrel because the non-commissioned officer wanted to keep all the champagne for himself. So a man of the 88th was chosen to set fire to the hotel, which he did, floor by floor. Many houses were destroyed in this way. About 6 o'clock, Murbach and I were sent to look for the paymaster, in order that rations might be distributed. We followed a little path between 2 hills to the right of the station. Soon we met a group of German soldiers, a seriously wounded French lieutenant in their midst. When he saw us, this officer said in German, "Gentlemen, I beg of you to deliver me from these wild beasts." The poor man had a bullet in his abdomen and seemed to be suffering intensely. Murbach suddenly became very much excited and answered brutally, "Take care of what you say and don't talk that way about brave soldiers who are fighting to deliver the world from the filthy French. As sure as I am standing here, I will not leave you until you have died before my eyes." "Lieutenant Murbach," said Paymaster Herbert, who had just joined us, "remember that he is an officer like yourself and that he is wounded." But Murbach did not wish to listen to anything and sent us away. He remained alone with the dying man. I told Major Schmidt of this affair, and he ordered Murbach to take command of the 8th Company, whose captain, Ziekenrath, had been wounded. 2 days afterwards, in the Battle of Bertrix, Murbach was killed by a French soldier who dealt him a musket blow on the head. He was one of my best friends. In the Battle of L'Anglier, the 2nd Battalion lost 5 officers and 60 men. Night fell, and we lay down in the midst of the dead and wounded, whose cries we heard all around us. Our camp was in a place about 2 kilometres east of L'Anglier, which continued to burn all through the night. It was impossible for most of us to rest because we were all unnerved. Many soldiers thanked God for having protected them. Others boasted of having killed many Belgians and French. Whenever, utterly tired out, we began to doze a little, nightmares or shells would rudely awaken us. At dawn we went on. For 8 hours we marched around Neufchâteau, where a battle seemed to have taken place, and then we were ordered to bivouac at Bercheux. We had the 87th French Infantry, aided by a company of Belgian cyclists opposite us. On August 22nd, the réveillé sounded at 5 o'clock in the morning. We marched off at 7, following the road to the left of L'Anglier. After passing through Tournai-en-Ardenne, we entered the forest of Houquant, where we snatched a moment's rest. Almost all the inhabitants of the village had fled precipitately, leaving their houses intact in the hands of the Germans, who were pillaging, breaking, and plundering everything. The soldiers, for their own amusement, were throwing furniture and dishes out of the windows. Schmidt, it is true, from time to time said that he would kill anyone who went into the houses, but the soldiers did as they pleased and did not obey Schmidt or anyone else. At 11 o'clock near the Luchy forest, on the way from Bertrix to Recogne, we received for the last time 2 days' rations. About 2 o'clock an order from the Army Corps was received. We were to attack immediately because the enemy, in great numbers, was getting ready to block our path, and perhaps to attempt to drive us back. 2 of our companies advanced on the left side of the road, and 2 on the right. We were assisted on the right by the 1st Battalion, and on the left by the 80th Fusiliers. The 7th Company was ordered to form in skirmish line, occupying the outskirts of the forest, and to open the attack. The first one to be killed was 1st Lieutenant Bertram. He fell, struck by the bullet of a German soldier named Schleisinger, whom the lieutenant had punished before the war by 3 days' imprisonment, and who wished to avenge himself, and had moreover so expressed himself to his comrades. His bullet made a little hole in the nape of Bertram's neck. This Schleisinger not only went unpunished, but a little while later received the Iron Cross for bravery. He died in the hospital at Nesle of wounds received in battle. The Battle of Bertrix was one of the most important in which our battalion took part. The French occupied a favourable position and tried their utmost to prevent our advance. In order to avoid being driven back, we had to sacrifice all our reserves. The fighting was desperate, and both sides displayed equal valour. The French artillery and machine gunners aimed very well and caused us great losses. A great many soldiers fell, dead or wounded, and it was impossible to bring aid to anyone, because each one of us had enough to do to shelter himself from bullets and shells. At one time we thought that everything was lost, and that we would have to retreat, when fortunately the 3rd Artillery Regiment of the Mayence fortress broke through the forest and arrived on the field. Hardly had the horses come out from the sheltering trees when they fell, overwhelmed by the French fire. Officers and soldiers set to work dragging the guns and pushing the wheels in order to be able to open fire as soon as possible. Many were killed. At last the 3rd Artillery was ready to fire, and our cause took a turn for the better. Some soldiers of the 5th and 8th Companies succeeded in gaining possession of guns belonging to the 18th French Artillery. The Frenchmen defended their guns, revolver in hand, and died bravely for their country. Then the Prussians cheered. The French, seeing a part of their artillery lost and one of their aviators fall, began to retreat slowly and to offer less resistance. The battle was over for that day, and the last rays of the sun gloomily lit up the field, covered with the wounded and dying. The next morning, August 23rd, the conflict began again, but less violently than on the previous day. Still keeping in skirmish line, we advanced, leaving Bertrix on our left. The soldiers were hungry, and many of them opened the knapsacks of dead French and Germans in order to find something to eat. Bertrix was burning, and we advanced through a field of unmowed grain. We spent the night between Fontenoy and Chassepierre on the French border. The next day, at 8 o'clock, we engaged in our first battle on French soil, in the neighbourhood of Maton, and in Maton itself. On the morning of August 24th, our battalion again happened to march at the head of the line. This did not please Major Schmidt or the soldiers at all, because we had already lost more men than all the other battalions. But Schmidt was the youngest commander, and he had to obey. The French, who were beating a slow retreat, had assumed the defensive in the woods near Maton. We attacked them, and a short while afterwards occupied their positions. Since we had no orders, we stayed right there in the trenches until the 80th came to relieve us. The field kitchens, which were 2 kilometres behind us, were waiting to give us a hot meal. The men were satisfied and had already forgotten the hardships of the previous days, but their happiness was of short duration. Indeed, the French had just made a counter-attack and had pushed aside the 80th, who lost the positions which we had gained. As soon as he was told of this, the commander of the army corps, Baron von Schenk, ordered Schmidt to attack immediately. Schmidt replied, "Your Excellency, my battalion has lost more men than all the others put together. My men have fought like lions. They have had almost nothing to eat for 3 days, and they can stand it no longer." "What's that? Are you not ashamed of yourself?" said Schenk. "You will attack immediately, and the knapsacks will remain here." Schmidt, with tears in his eyes, grasped the battalion standard and placed himself at the head of his men. He was seeking death. Because of this incident, Schmidt became popular with all the soldiers. On the other hand, he was unfavourably regarded by his superiors and ended by handing in his resignation in April 1915. Our artillery, which had done pretty good work that day, helped us take Maton, which was already completely demolished, only a few houses remaining intact. When the 80th came to relieve us, the soldiers exchanged musket blows and kicks. Our men called them cowards and full-dress soldiers. Our officers said nothing but spat on the ground to express their disgust before their comrades of the 80th. We had to go about 12 kilometres to get our knapsacks, and at about 8 p.m. we took up our quarters in more or less ruined houses. The soldiers broke everything that was still whole. They made fires of furniture and planks torn from the floors. They found a good deal of linen, especially women's underwear. Many men threw aside their shirts and put on women's chemises, which they said were much more comfortable in the heat. No one could forbid them anything, for most of them were drunk and would not obey. They quarrelled in front of the cellar entrances and had only one fear, that they might leave some wine for others. Often in their haste they forgot to turn off the taps so that the cellars were flooded with wine. Besides, many officers, especially reserve officers, were the first to set a bad example. I lived with Major Schmidt and his entire staff in the house of a retired French captain that was still intact. He told Schmidt that he could not understand how, in an army like ours, which had such a reputation for discipline, the soldiers could be permitted to plunder and steal as they had just done at Maton. Schmidt asked me to answer him by saying that unfortunately he could not punish the soldiers because too many officers themselves had given such a bad example. "How does it happen," the old French captain went on, "that you mobilized so quickly? In France there was so. Little thought of war that we did not even have the time necessary to prepare for our defence." Lieutenant Wunderlich made him understand that Germany had been preparing for a new war for 44 years, while in France the people had only begun to think of such a thing about a year or two ago. On the next morning, August 25th, at 9:30, Paymaster Herbert arrived with supply wagons in order to distribute provisions among the kitchens. Then we saw who the true thieves, the greatest plunderers, were. What had they not stolen? Full trunks, clothing, materials, clocks, phonographs, and even umbrellas, canes and other things of no earthly use to a soldier. Beside the regulation wagons, there were a lot of others loaded with loot. Some were entirely filled with wine. When he saw this, Schmidt asked, since when had he become a robber captain? The paymaster answered, without moving a muscle, that there had been no way of preventing the soldiers from entering abandoned houses. "Fine excuses," answered Schmidt. "I believe you are war profiteers. While the soldiers at the front are sacrificing their skins, you gentlemen to the rear steal at leisure." This band of thieves brought with them a quantity of provisions stolen from the houses and stores, and all sorts of poultry, geese actually hanging out of the wagons. At 2 p.m. the regiment left Maton to march on Carignan. Along the road we could see ambulances and shattered wagons and the bodies of soldiers and horses which, because of the heat, were beginning to pollute the air. We also saw dead cows and pigs which the soldiers had left to rot after they had cut from them such meat as they wanted at the moment. It was the work of marauders who wage war for their own personal gain, and only appear in their units to get their pay. At Carignan, for lack of space, we had to camp out. On the 26th, we acted as reserves for the troops fighting around Mouzon. During the night, it rained so hard that we had to go into the houses for shelter. Naturally, the soldiers had to stay indoors, and that caused some grumbling. I overheard Klein, a first-class private, express himself as follows: "Whenever there is anything good to be had, it's for the officers. As for us, they leave us wherever we are and don't even look at us. But let the battle come, then they are scared. They compliment us and flatter us because they are afraid. Then they are just like little children. But when the danger is over, they resume their authoritative tone and treat us like dogs." On August 27th, we crossed the Meuse near Carignan without any difficulty. We encamped at Villemotry, which had not suffered much. But the inhabitants complained of the raids and pillages of the soldiers, who, through their threats, got money and other valuables. In the evening, every soldier received a bottle of wine. The men, already fed by the kitchens, nevertheless prepared another meal for themselves, composed of chickens and other provisions, stolen from the village. Indeed, nothing was left of the chickens and geese except the feathers which flew around in the streets. On August 28th, Reveille sounded at 5 o'clock, the last Reveille, alas, for the many of us who were to fall on that day. We formed part of the left wing of the 21st Division and participated in the battle waged. We were stationed in and around Sedan, between Haraucourt and Autrecourt. The 25th Division was on our left. The French artillery aimed very well, but with small results, because most of their projectiles did not explode. The shrapnel shells were the most dangerous, because when they burst, it was at a certain height, and a shower of bullets rained down upon us. They caused us great losses. We were lying on the crest of a small hill to the east of Autrecourt, and we could not possibly advance because of the murderous fire of the French, who shot at all those who were foolish enough to raise their heads. Loffelhart and I marched with the battalion, while Lieutenant Wunderlich, a drum major and a non-commissioned officer, stayed about 50 paces behind us with the telephone in order to keep up communication with the rest of the regiment. A shell, which exploded right where they stood, struck a telephone operator, so that he was literally cut to pieces, and wounded Lieutenant Wunderlich in the back and in the arm. After we had surged forward and backward several times, we ended by succeeding in getting into the village, which was completely destroyed. As at L'Anglier, I saw half-burned corpses lying among the ruins. The wounded groaned, and the frightened animals bellowed loudly in the stables. It was about 2 o'clock when we entered Autrecourt. In order to try to see Wunderlich, I, together with the major, sought the field hospital which had been installed in the church. A frightful spectacle met our eyes, and our nerves were subjected to a severe test. At first it was impossible to find Wunderlich, so filled was the church with the wounded. We would have had to step over their bodies. Among others, I remember the son of a merchant from Hanau on the Main, who had lost both eyes. He screamed fit to break one's heart and kept calling for his mother. In his agony he tore off the dressing, and we could see how horrible his wound was. Others had 1 or 2 limbs shot away, or had their stomachs torn open by shells. Some bore their suffering resignedly. Others, on the contrary, uttered loud shrieks. In a garden to the right of the church were the French wounded. I must say that most of them did not scream, either because they were afraid to or because of national pride, and for the sake of setting the Germans a good example of courage. We asked the nurses why they did not carry these wounded Frenchmen into the houses, instead of letting them lie out in the open. "We have no room," they answered. "Besides, it is not cold during the night, and they are well covered." Let it be said in passing that the nurses are the greatest thieves on earth. We camped north of Autrecourt. The companies assembled to report their losses in dead, wounded, and prisoners. Only then I realized how hot the fighting had been. All the companies had lost more than half of their fighting force in dead or wounded. Many of the soldiers walked over the battlefield to find their friends, but most of them were not ashamed to explore the pockets of the dead. To any questions they answered that they were looking for identification tags. To put these ghouls to flight, it was necessary for Schmidt to issue a formal order, threatening to shoot immediately any man who should touch a corpse. The Meuse flowed calmly at our feet, indifferent to all this wretchedness of which, nevertheless, it was the primary cause. In order that the convoys might cross the river, the 21st Pioneers had built a bridge at Villa, just ahead of Mouzon. Because one could not see very well there, and as the crossing was making slow progress, the Pioneers set fire to the houses nearest to the river. The fires spread over the village, and soon it was all aflame, so that one could see as though in full daylight. The general commanding the Army Corps congratulated the 21st Pioneers. On August 29, 1914, after having received a fresh supply of rations, we set out for Raucourt. During the march, our new aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Kedor, especially distinguished himself. He was a booby who maltreated the soldiers who were already suffering greatly from the heat and from thirst. As they were not marching quickly enough, he threatened them with his crop, insulted them and called them dogs, pigs, band of peasants, herd of cows, etc. Nevertheless, during the battle, no one ever saw this hero, who preferred to stay near the kitchens where shells and bullets did not fall. This, however, did not prevent him from being one of the first in the regiment to receive the Iron Cross. About 3 p.m. we arrived at Raucourt. Here something happened which ought not to have occurred. But honestly speaking, who in the German army still had any respect for the Red Cross, non-combatants, women, etc.? Not many. The 87th Infantry, which was in the lead, had not neglected to take all precautions, and had sent patrols in various directions. Some of these patrols preferred to remain quietly at an inn at Raucourt, rather than fulfill their mission. They stripped the entire house, and after taking whatever pleased them, went into the cellar. There they seized a lot of wine, especially champagne, as was afterwards proved by the number of empty bottles lying about on the ground. It was not long before they were completely drunk. Then, whether it was the result of a quarrel, or whether it was by accident, one of the soldiers was killed by the sideboard in the dining room. He had been hit by the butt end of a rifle which had opened his skull like a melon. His brain oozed out. His eyes, as big as fists, hung from their sockets. He was completely disfigured. So that no one could identify him, the murderers had hidden his papers and taken his military certificate out of his knapsack, which was still lying in front of him, with the contents all thrown about. What indicated that the murderers were not civilians was the fact that he still held his own gun, and that the murderer's gun, the butt all covered with blood, was still there. Lieutenant Kedor, the non-commissioned officers, door of the regimental staff, Hallenbach, Loffelhart and I were the first to enter the house, for a crowd of civilians and soldiers had assembled outside the door without daring to go in. We immediately understood what had happened, and saw that only a German soldier could have committed the murder. Kedor said, "Who will denounce the criminals so that they will be punished for their crime? They will never be found. Nevertheless, we cannot allow the honour of the German army to be sullied in this way." With these words he went out of the house and accused the inhabitants of Raucourt of having murdered a Prussian soldier. Immediately under Colonel Puder's orders, First Lieutenant Schafitzel, the adjutant of the regiment, arrested all the inhabitants of the houses near the inn, about 20 in number. These miserable people swore that the soldiers were fighting among themselves and that they were innocent. Whereupon Puder shouted, "Kill this whole crowd immediately, even though the innocent will suffer with the guilty, and set fire to the hotel and the neighbouring houses." Perhaps he thought that one of these wretches might denounce someone else, but in this he was mistaken. However, before he could countermand the order, the soldiers, like wild beasts, threw themselves on the 15 or 20 men and women, condemned without a trial by Colonel Puder, and killed them wildly with bayonet thrusts. During this time others hastily set fire to the houses and to the hotel, which were in flames within a few moments. Then the soldiers scattered over the whole village, maltreating and terrorizing all the inhabitants. They were allowed full liberty to do as they pleased. The battalion camped outside of the village in a field, where the bodies of French colonial soldiers were still lying about. We suffered much for want of tobacco. Major Schmidt and we ourselves smoked tea. The soldiers smoked dry leaves. Many stripped the dead in order to find some tobacco, which they resold for gold. Soldiers gave watches, rings, and French or Belgian gold pieces in exchange for a few cigarettes. Where did all this money and these valuables come from, since the German soldier is paid only 5 3/10 marks every 10 days? On the next day, a Sunday and a day of rest, a religious service was held at which the chaplain of the 21st Division preached, taking as his text, "Love thy neighbour as thyself." At 11:30, a Mass for the Catholic soldiers was held in the church of Raucourt. Because we of the General Staff were in want of wine, Major Schmidt told me to try and sneak out with Loffelhart and find some. So I started a little investigation among the inhabitants of the village, who advised me to apply at a villa, situated at the northern limit of Raucourt. This villa was occupied by an old lady who lived there alone with her son, and who was likely to have a lot of wine in her cellar. When non-commissioned officer Kumpfe, Loffelhart and I presented ourselves at the villa, we were thrown out by a young lieutenant who had already taken up his quarters there. So we returned to Major Schmidt to tell him of the failure of our mission. Kedor, who was never afraid in such a case, said that we must return there with him. When we arrived, the young lieutenant had gone away, and we were able to see the lady at once. We explained the purpose of our visit, but she told us, "Gentlemen, everything in this house has already been taken by the general who lives here." "And where is this gentleman?" I asked. "He has gone out," she said. "Very well. When he returns, you will show him our certificate of requisition." Whereupon we went down into the cellar and immediately began to pack up some bottles of champagne and other wines. As we were making ready to leave, with about 30 bottles, the young officer received us at the door of the cellar with these words, "I'll teach you to drink my champagne. You drink water, you rascals." But Kedor, who was not afraid, shouted in his face, "What are you saying? Who are you? What are you doing in this house?" "I am the general's adjutant, and I order you to leave this wine alone and to quit this place as quickly as possible." "Shut up! Keep your mouth closed. I am older than you. I believe you are only an impostor. You'll hear from me," answered the bold Kedor. Finally, we arrived at Schmidt's quarters with our stolen wine, but we could not drink much of it since our departure was fixed for 4:30. We had hardly time to have a bite before setting out. Barely 6 kilometres from Raucourt, we had to halt in order to let other troops go by, because we were the reserves. This delay gave Schmidt an opportunity to send us back to get some more wine, because we would probably be going through places which had already been stripped of everything by the troops preceding us. So I set out with Lieutenant Abraham of the 8th Company and Loffelhart. All of us rode bicycles. We were delighted to be able to annoy the young lieutenant again. In the village, Lieutenant Abraham stopped a moment to speak to some soldier acquaintances, so Loffelhart and I went on ahead and presented ourselves alone at the door of the old lady's villa. We knocked several times, but no one answered. Then we jumped over the garden wall and removed the iron bar in order to open the door and put our bicycles inside. We were very much surprised to hear threatening words in German. The door of the house was also closed, so we climbed in at a window, and were soon in the room from which the noise came. There we saw a strange sight. In the room were non-commissioned officer Kumpfe, who was one of our party the first time we had come for the wine, Janeke, a first-class private, and the old lady. The latter was completely undressed and appeared about to faint. When she saw us, she started to cry, probably thinking that we also had come to hurt her. I told her to dress herself and to tell us what had happened. "About half an hour ago," she said, "these two gentlemen broke into my room through the window and asked for money. I told them I had none because my son had gone away and taken it with him. Not understanding French, they thought I was refusing to give it to them. I took them into the dining room to give them something to eat, but they pointed their revolvers at me and dragged me into this room. I tried to make them understand that they would find nothing which would be of the slightest value to them. Then the taller one, this was Kumpfe, sat down on my bed and made me understand by signs that I was to get undressed. In like manner, I tried to convey to him that I am an old woman, 63 years old, and begged him to remember his mother and to spare me such dishonour. Then this gentleman took a candle and set fire to my bed. I beg you to look at the sheets and blankets. Half mad with fear, I tore off my clothes, ready to submit to the inevitable, when luckily you gentlemen came. Then I explained to the lady why we had come back to see her, that she must not be afraid of us, and that we would pay her in requisition certificates, which had the same value as current money. Kumpfe, now thoroughly scared, begged me to say nothing of what we had seen. Both he and Janeke asked the old lady's pardon. She also asked us not to say anything, because she did not want these men to be punished, and because she was embarrassed by the whole business. Löffelhardt and I promised her to keep it secret. She asked us all to have something to eat, and you may be sure we did not refuse. Lieutenant Abraham, who had just arrived, also accepted her invitation, and seemed very much pleased with the good woman. We did not tell him all that she had endured. After supper, she herself took us to the cellar to get some wine. Since we could not carry it all with us, we told her to bury the rest, because I had marked on the requisition bill that we had taken everything, but I doubt if she did that. Later on, when Kumpfe wanted to order Janeke to do something, the latter said in a clear voice, "Rokor." Kumpfe immediately turned pale and gave his orders to another soldier. In the evening we rejoined the battalion, laden like mules, to Schmidt's great satisfaction. The villages through which we passed were for the most part completely ruined, and in many of them even the churches were no longer standing. Now the Battle of the Marne awaited us, the Marne where the French showed the stuff they were made of, and where General Joffre closed the door on our hopes and illusions. Here I wish to tell of some of the foolish ideas of our soldiers, in order to show to what extent these illusions were spread about. We were to enter Paris immediately. That went without saying, and no one doubted it for a moment. But all the soldiers were convinced that we would be in England very soon as well. "How are we going to get to England?" asked one. "Don't worry," replied another. "Wilhelm has already prepared everything. One fine day Dover will be bombarded from Calais, and we will quietly set off for London, where we can eat our fill of pudding."